Welcome to EEGworld. I'm Nikki Wittridge, and today I'm joined by Cory Williams. Cory's the Director of Neurofeedback and Functional Neuroimaging at Nashville Child and Family Wellness. We discuss Cory's EEG and neurofeedback journey, basic drug effects on brainwaves, the paradox of the benzo buzz, the EEG phenotypes model, conflicts between EEG approaches and psychiatry, how to think about a mental health issue, when neurofeedback fails, environmental toxicity, and some other topics as well. You can check those out in the video description below. Thank you to my first Patreon supporter, Simone Songard. And if you want to support the show, you can do so at patreon.com/EEGworld. And now I give you Cory Williams.
Neurofeedback's a different story. So when I left teaching, I moved from New Mexico to Charleston, South Carolina. And it was the summer, and I was looking for maybe some part-time work. I thought I might go back to teaching. I hadn't decided yet. And a neurofeedback clinic had a job opening, an advertisement on Craigslist. So not really knowing what neurofeedback was at the time, I applied to the job. In my initial interview, the lead neurofeedback kind of director said, there may be moments when you have one or even two kids in the room. They'll both have ADHD, and it will be your job to keep them focused and on task on a screen. And I had just been teaching third grade. I had a classroom of 24 kids. 8 of them had IEPs, so a third of them. And so I said, 2 sounds like a cakewalk. I can do 2. And we both kind of like laughed about it. So I got hired on as a technician, right? That's just the kind of like low-level, entry-level position. And at the end of the first week, I went back to my boss and I said, I've read all of the hardware manuals that we have for all of the different amplifiers and training systems we have. I've read all the software manuals for all the training stuff that we have. I've read all the patient files for everybody we saw this week and next week. And I read all the papers that you have in your little like on-site library. This is the coolest thing I have ever seen. It is endlessly fascinating to me. I don't want to go back to teaching. I just want to do this now. And he responded, if that's how you feel, then we can do that. So that's how the path started. At the time, when I applied for the job, for the neurofeedback job, I was reading just for fun, just sort of on the side, a book about neurology. I don't remember the name or the author, but each chapter was about different aspects of neurology and sort of just different interesting phenomena that occur in neurology. And the first chapter was about phantom limbs. So I remember just reading about, neurology in the brain and how just supremely interesting the brain can be. And then I had an opportunity to work with brains, and I thought this is a match made in heaven. This is super cool.
And how long ago was that you were first starting as a trainer?
Oh, I think 8 years ago. So maybe 7, something like that. Yeah, I started with Rusty Turner. People in the EEG world know him. He's a pediatric neurologist. He was the head of neurology at MUSC, which is the teaching college in South Carolina. And then he had left there to open a private practice. And that's where I kind of signed on and started working in the first place.
And then, so you began as a technician in
Mhm.
neurofeedback, working for Rusty Turner, and where are you now?
Now I run the neurofeedback and functional neuroimaging department at Nashville Child and Family Wellness. So it's a multidisciplinary mental health private practice. We have 2 full-time psychiatrists. I think we have 5 or 6 nurse practitioners, we just added a bunch of new therapists, maybe 12 therapists. Don't quote me on that. That number may have gone up around 15. So a number of therapists, they all specialize in different things. So we've got like somebody who specializes in family counseling, marriage counseling, adults, adolescents, that kind of thing, different specialties. And I run the neurofeedback and QEEG imaging sort of department for that practice.
And when did you start getting interested in pharmaco-EEG?
The day I took this job. When I worked for Rusty, and this gets into kind of like scope of practice and what different doctors specialize in and what they do. So when I worked for Rusty in Charleston, he's a neurologist. And so we did see people on medication, but the medication was almost always anti-seizure medication. And there are, I don't know how many, but there's a number of anti-seizure medications, and they all kind of do roughly similar things to the brain or to the EEG, with the goal being to stabilize spikes or seizures. When I took the job in Nashville, which I think is 6 years ago at this point, 5 years ago, something like that, I noticed almost immediately, because it's a mental health clinic, run by a psychiatrist, that the number of medications we used were wildly different, right? We went from, in neurology, seeing the same maybe 4 or 5 anti-seizure medications to suddenly seeing SSRIs, SNRIs, stimulants, mood stabilizers, antipsychotic, the whole gamut of mental health medication. And so pretty much from day one, maybe my first or second EEG with the practice, I started asking, well, if this person is on all of these different medications, or sometimes even just 1 or 2 medications, what do these medications do to the brain? And what do they do to the brain from a chemical sense? So we had to do some learning there. And then also, what do they do to the brain from a electrophysiological sense? Are they changing the EEG data? Because my job is to record EEG and write electrophysiological diagnostic reports, like, this is what this person's EEG looks like. And so I wanted to know if my data set looked different because of different medications. So pretty much from day one, I started pulling together a master list of EEG effects from various medications when I could find them. So it turned into just a gigantic research project, but it's not that I sat down to research it all at one time. It was much more of, well, this person's taking Lexapro. Okay, let me quickly research, are there any known effects of Lexapro on an EEG? And I would add that to the list. And then the next day, did an EEG for someone taking methylphenidate and Buspar. Okay, let me look up those 2 medications, see if there are any EEG effects, add them to the list. And it just sort of built that way. So it built kind of organically.
And so for someone who's like more new to pharmaco-EEG, or even newer to EEG, could you, give an example of like a simple effect from a drug and how it might impact the EEG?
Yeah. So the most common, I think the most commonly mentioned in neurology textbooks, the most common that we see, maybe not in our practice, but certainly in EEG literature, is sometimes referred to as the benzo buzz. Benzodiazepines tend to increase low beta. It's in the 15, 16, all the way up to 18, 19 hertz range. And the effects tend to be pretty diffuse, meaning you see them across all channels, right? People have organic beta spindling. That's a different thing that's associated with anxiety, insomnia. There's lots of stuff with beta spindles. Those tend to be frontally and sometimes centrally located. The beta buzz tends to be everywhere. It's sort of in every channel all at the same time. And so if you have somebody who's taking, Valium, other commonly prescribed benzos, and you look at their EEG and you see that there's beta everywhere, it's a pretty good guess that that is not representative of what their EEG looks like at a resting state. And, you know, what you're getting in that moment is what their EEG looks like when influenced by the medication. That has really large implications for both diagnostic and treatment, right? If we associate elevated levels of beta with anything from anxiety to neuroinflammation to OCD, and then we see somebody, and especially if we don't know what their medication regime looks like, and we see all this diffuse beta, we might jump to the wrong conclusions about what's going on in their brain. You know, we might say, oh, wow, this is a really severe anxiety. This is really severe OCD. There's some type of gut issue that's causing tremendous amounts of inflammation. And the reality is they just took a Valium, 20 minutes before they came to see you. And then from a treatment perspective, especially for people who are using neurofeedback as a treatment modality, you can downtrain beta when it's of organic origin, right? If a person's brain is making too much beta, you can downtrain that. But if a person's brain is making too much beta because of medication effects, that becomes quite difficult to downtrain. You can't downtrain med effects. So it ends up being very important, both from the diagnostic side of things and from the treatment side of things.
And what's wrong with benzos?
Well, that's a very good question for someone who prescribes medication, right? I'm not a doctor. I'm not an MD. I don't prescribe meds. In my personal opinion, they are highly, highly addictive and lead to higher and higher doses. That would be my biggest issue with them. This is again a question for someone who's an expert in the pharmacology of it all, but my general understanding is that benzos tend to trigger receptor sites in a way that makes them less susceptible to additional benzo use, which means you need to increase the dose each time to get the same effect. So you have people who are sort of chasing a high a little bit, similar to what happens with opioids, I think.
And you mentioned, and by the way, it's okay to give opinion. I'm asking for opinions here, and yeah, you have qualifications as a mental health worker of sorts. You have a master's of. What are your qualifications?
Yeah, so I have a master's of science in psychology, and then I have my BCN, which is sort of a clinical certification in neurofeedback from the BCIA, and I have my QEEGD, which is the sort of EEG analytic qualification from the EEG board, which is an offshoot of the ISNR. It's alphabet soup out here, man, I'm telling you.
Yeah. So yeah, none of this is medical advice. We're just talking over here. And, another interesting thing from the perspective of benzos is, we see that it, like you said, increases beta in the 15 to 18 hertz range. And it's always been interesting to me that it does that and has this anxiolytic effect. And yet that's the same range where if we were to see beta activity in the brain, we might associate it with anxiety. So how does that match up? How can those two things exist at the same time?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It might be the first question I asked when I started down this studying EEG effects journey, I guess we can call it. You look at a stimulant medication and you see it decreases theta, and you think, okay, excess frontal theta is a common finding in ADHD. So the stimulant decreases theta. That makes sense to me. I can make those puzzle pieces match. Like you said, benzos increase beta, and beta is a marker for anxiety. So why are we increasing beta when we want to decrease anxiety? I asked a couple people about it. I think it was Dave Cantor who gave me the answer that made the most sense. If you all don't know Dave, he's fantastic. Runs a shop just out of Atlanta, I think. But anyway, Dr. Cantor told me that the increase in beta represents an increase in activity but that activity is largely centered in inhibitory neurons. So neurons that are trying to calm things down or slow things down, which we would associate with having less anxiety, those neurons become hyperactivated by the benzos. And so you see the excess beta, and that beta is sort of centered in inhibitory neurons.
So those neurons would probably be GABAergic related, GABA related neurons and glycine related neurons.
I would think so. I mean, obviously the brain is incredibly complex. My sort of shortcut is always GABA turns off and glutamate turns on. That's the sort of short and dirty version of it.
Okay, so we've talked about benzos, and you also mentioned stimulant medication. It's a more clear and intuitive example of like a medication effect because it kind of does what we think it does. So could you speak more to, the presentation of ADD, ADHD, attention issues, and how that interacts with theta and then our decision-making process about pharma?
Sure, yeah. And if you go back and look at the literature, I think Jay Gunkelman published, a few others have been in this space. We can look at ADHD as probably 5, 6, 7, depending on how picky you want to be. In my head, it's 6 phenotypes for ADHD, which means that there are 6 different ways that the brain can kind of present with issues that will end up in a ADHD diagnosis. So the most common by far is frontal theta, excess frontal theta. And theta typically has a limbic generator. So what we see here is that the sort of deeper areas of the front of the brain, primarily the anterior cingulate cortex, are a little bit underpowered. They're not producing enough beta. And usually if something is underpowered, we're going to see slow wave activity. So think delta, think theta, sometimes alpha too. So that excess frontal theta coming from the anterior cingulate is sort of a clear marker for ADHD, the most common presentation. When we see that, and when I break down EEG reports with clients, I always kind of explain it in a straightforward way. We have a couple questions we need to ask. What's the type of activity? So in this case, we're talking about frontal theta. Where does it occur? So in this case, the anterior cingulate. And then what does that area do? So in this case, the anterior cingulate is responsible or plays as a major hub of 2 networks, the attention and executive function network and the emotional regulation network. And so both of those networks are likely to be impacted if we have frontal slowing. If you're using just an EEG, just a regular EEG with no extra layers of analysis, you can see that frontal theta typically in FZ, F3, F4, sometimes FP1, FP2, sometimes in central channels as well. If you have more advanced imaging techniques, like an S-Loretta or something like that, you'll usually see that activity is coming from a deeper source. If you do an ICA analysis, you're going to find that it's coming from the anterior cingulate. So, going back to the medication piece of things, we know that methylphenidate-based stimulants tend to reduce theta and increase beta. And that's the exact effect that we want to have on a brain that has too much frontal theta. And even that goes back to the research from Lubar about theta-beta ratio. And obviously, we know now with the host of other studies that have been published since then, that original study on theta-beta ratio was maybe a little bit flawed, but I think he was on the right path of we're looking at levels of activation, and having too much theta is indicative of not enough activation. So that's where that stimulant medication comes in handy. We also found in research published by Ron Swatzina that there's a a difference in ADHD and in medication response between frontal theta and slow posterior dominant rhythm. So your posterior dominant rhythm in the average, let's say, person, it changes by age, but 10 years old and up, the average is going to be 8 to 12 hertz with a peak around 10. And some people say 9, some people say 10, but around there. But that's the average. And so if you do enough EEGs, eventually you find people who have a fast posterior dominant rhythm. Maybe it goes 9 to 12, and then you find people with a slow one. So maybe it goes 7 to 11. And in some cases, it's quite slow. So I've seen EEGs where the posterior dominant rhythm is maybe 6 to 9 hertz and peaks at 7.5. Well, if you're looking at spectral maps, if you're looking at Fourier transformed maps, a 7.5 hertz, even though we're talking about the posterior dominant rhythm, what we would sometimes refer to as an alpha rhythm, that's quite slow. And that shows up in the theta range. So this is another case where you have maps that look like too much theta, but are not actually theta. They're something quite different. They're a slow alpha. It's the alpha peak is too slow. Those brains, those phenotypes, respond much better to amphetamine class stimulants than they do methylphenidate class stimulants. So that's more along the lines of like Adderall or Dexedrine, right? And so by doing an EEG, you get to see, is this frontal slowing or is this a slow posterior dominant rhythm? If you just look at maps, they probably look pretty similar. But if you look at the raw data and you look at individual spectral analysis, you're going to see that they're actually quite different and they're going to respond to different medications.
And so why are we not doing this with every prescription?
I don't know. There are.
Take a guess.
Take a guess. So I think a big part of it has to do with the way people are trained or the way people are educated. There's a psychiatrist named Nash Boutros. I think he's out of St. Louis, but I might have that wrong. Don't quote me on that. But he wrote a book called EEG in Functional Psychiatry, or maybe it's Functional EEG in Psychiatry, one of those two things. And his whole book is about how easy it is to use EEG in a psychiatric practice to improve your outcomes. So there are people who acknowledge we should be doing this. EEG machines are relatively cheap. It's relatively easy to use. Obviously it requires training on the interpretation side, but that can be done. That's an easy step, and it improves outcomes dramatically. So why aren't we using it everywhere? I don't know. I think, going back to it's how people get educated. I think that there is some hesitancy between the sort of mental health field and the neurology field. There's just not a lot of crossover, right? Psychiatrists get, I think it's a week of neurology training when they're doing rounds in med school, but that's it. So there's just not a lot of comfort with knowing how to analyze or interpret that data set. And I think that's a big barrier. So the easiest step, and it doesn't affect the people who are in practice now, but might be to sort of increase the requirements for people getting degrees in psychiatry to be more comfortable studying neurology, learning neurological terms, interpreting EEG.
So you've created a document with all the different drug effects, and the effects on the EEG, and also the effects of the drugs and potential side effects as well. And it's been in process over time, really more as a reference for you in the beginning. What sort of like surprised you the most as far as like an EEG effect?
Abilify. So if you read literature on antipsychotic presentation, or sorry, if you read literature on psychotic presentation and EEG and the psychotic symptoms, often those people have unstable EEGs, right? They have epilleptiform discharges, they have spike and slow waves, they have these big high amplitude transients, they have all kinds of stuff that means this is an unstable EEG. So those people go to psychiatry, they get put on an antipsychotic, and one of the more common antipsychotics is Abilify. And Abilify inherently destabilizes EEG. It increases slow wave activity, it increases spike activity, and as a side effect, as a known side effect of Abilify, it has seizures listed. So we're taking people whose brains are already walking up to the edge of a seizure but not quite jumping off, and then we're giving them a medication that potentiates seizures. I think that one surprised me the most, because I can understand counterintuitive things. There's too much beta, so we gave a medication that increases beta. Okay, I can get there, but this person almost had a seizure, and we give them medication that increases the chance they'll have a seizure. That one was really hard for me to kind of wrap my head around.
And in researching that, did you come across, literature about how it may not be efficacious, or how do we explain that it's being used in psychiatry? I mean, I assume there's some people that it does further destabilize and some people that it doesn't, and it's kind of just like a crapshoot.
Yeah, and I think with antipsychotic medication, at least my understanding is that those people are already pretty medication unresponsive, right? They're already struggling, and they're struggling more than just maybe a simple case of ADHD or a simple case of anxiety. By the time most medication providers get to an antipsychotic, there have already been multiple drug trials, most of which didn't work. And so I think that by the time they get to the end, I don't know of any providers who, the first time they meet a patient, say, let's start with an antipsychotic. Now, also, we work in a very different setting than those people, right? We work in an outpatient setting. We're not seeing people who are, heavily suspected of psychosis, right? That might be different for people who work in, say, a center that specializes in schizophrenia. They might be very comfortable first time they meet a client saying, here's an antipsychotic, here you go. But that's not where we work, and that's not what we do. So I think by the time most of the people that we see are trialing an antipsychotic, they've already tried a bunch of medications that didn't work. And so if the antipsychotic also doesn't work, it just sort of reinforces the pattern of this patient is medication resistant, or this patient is really difficult to find the right medication choice. So it doesn't maybe ring as many alarm bells because they've already failed a bunch of med trials. And I'm very thankful that where I work, when people start failing med trials, our medical staff is very happy to say, let's go get an EEG and see if there's something we missed. That's not the case everywhere. I wish it was, but it is one of the things that I love about where I work, is that instead of just kind of repeatedly, let's try this one, well, let's try this one, well, let's try this one, well, let's try this one, we're very good about saying, hey, if these two didn't work, maybe we should take a look at your brain and see if there's something we're missing.
Earlier on, you mentioned phenotypes.
Mm-hmm.
And can you expand on that? There's this paper by Gunkelman et al. I think Joy Lunt was on that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a little while ago as well. It was a couple decades ago that the original paper was published. And you talked about it in the context of like, we have different phenotypes for example, ADD. So on a broad level, like, what is a phenotype from like the genetics perspective? And then in the context of EEG, what does it mean?
So on the broad level, from the genetic perspective, phenotype is how are the genes expressed? Like, what do we see? right? So if you think back to your high school biology class and you have those square puzzles, right? Big A, little a. And the one I always remember is seed pods. Are they smooth or are they wrinkled? So the genetics would be, is it big A, little a, right? Dominant trait, non-dominant trait. And then the phenotype is, what does it look like? Is it smooth or is it wrinkled? So the phenotype is how the genes are expressed. So when we look at brain phenotypes, there's, I don't know, 6 to 9 to 12. Different people have categorized or classified different things. You can argue about it depending on who wrote what paper, how many exactly there are. I, in my clinical practice, have kind of pushed into predominant EEG features because I think phenotype can be a little bit limiting, and we always see mixed expression, right? So if you go back and read that original phenotype paper, one phenotype is frontal slowing, one phenotype is fast alpha, but that makes it sound like those are two distinct things. And I see people with both of those things all the time, you know? And so the way that we sort of think about it when we do EEG reports, when I do EEG reports, are what are the predominant features? So not necessarily a phenotype, but we're using that same language. You know, this is a beta spindling brain, or this brain has spindling beta activity. This brain has insufficient alpha activity. This brain has excess frontal theta activity. All of those are phenotypes in that original paper. We're just talking about it more in terms of these are salient EEG features that are worth mentioning. And because of that, oftentimes when we make medication recommendations based on phenotype, we end up making more than one recommendation, right? And part of that gets into how the individual client or patient is experiencing those symptoms. So for example, you see somebody who has frontal alpha, high frontal alpha. Well, that's a phenotype. It's common in anxiety. It's common in OCD, sometimes in depression. High frontal alpha will sometimes, if you go by like phenotype and medication response, it's more likely to respond to an SSRI. Okay. And then that person also has, say, a fast alpha peak, right? So their alpha activity is also quite fast. That is a phenotype for anxiety, sometimes perfectionism, and it's going to respond from a medication perspective to Buspar. So when we look at that person from a clinical perspective, and I look at their EEG and I put all that into a report and give it to the medication provider, and the medication provider during their clinical interview will try to suss out, are we more concerned about symptoms that look like OCD or depression, or are we more concerned about symptoms that look like overarousal and anxiety? And if the answer is A, we're going to go SSRI. And if the answer is B, we're going to go Buspar. And maybe the answer is yes and both equal, in which case that person might leave that office with 2 prescriptions, right? So I don't really think of it so much in terms of phenotypes, because again, that feels very, it's A, B, or C. And so much of what we see is blended or mixed.
So do you feel like the phenotypes model then is somewhat outdated, or is it just sort of incomplete?
I would lean more towards incomplete, and I think maybe even changing the language. I really believe that what we're talking about are prominent EEG features, and so that's what we should be talking about. You know, the good thing about the phenotype model, or if we call them prominent EEG features, whatever we want to call them, is that it makes research about efficacy much, much easier. So when we do neurofeedback or neuromodulation and it's QEEG guided, we are looking at someone's EEG. We are deciding from that EEG what areas of their brain need the most help or are most dysregulated. And then we are designing training protocols to address that specific EEG. The reason that makes research difficult is because let's say you're trying to study the efficacy of neurofeedback or neuromodulation or whatever your intervention is in the treatment of anxiety. And you take 30 people, all of whom have anxiety, 15 are a control group, 15 are your experimental group. Within that experimental group, you're going to get a bunch of different brain maps. You're going to get fast alpha, you're going to get frontal alpha, you're going to get frontal beta, you're going to get beta asymmetries. And each of those would be a different neurofeedback protocol, right? We would treat or train each of those brains differently. And so the beauty of the phenotype model is that you can say, we're going to take all of the people with frontal beta spindling, and we are going to give them this one specific protocol. So instead of saying we're treating anxiety, the diagnosis, we're treating this brain type or this EEG feature. And then you can design fantastic studies. It takes more on the inclusion-exclusion criteria, right? We're taking 50 people with anxiety, 30 of them are ruled out because their brain doesn't match this feature or this phenotype. And then with the people who are left over, then we're designing our study. So it's really, really useful for from a research perspective on understanding or researching the efficacy of neurofeedback in treatment. That's what I love about it. So I don't want to say it's outdated because I think it has a crucial role to play in the way that we design further studies and the way that we research efficacy. I do think that in terms of our understanding of the brain, it's probably incomplete because multiple phenotypes can be expressed in one person, and because we know that expression can be changed, right? That's what we do. If somebody has frontal alpha, we downtrain frontal alpha and we expect that it goes down, it gets less. So it can't just be genetic expression because we're changing it so easily, right? So I do think that model is a little bit incomplete, but certainly not obsolete. It has a pretty important role to play moving forward.
And you mentioned, research and how we can conduct better research with this sort of features-based approach. Do you have any insight into why neurofeedback research is still so difficult, or maybe not getting the results that a clinician would want? Taking ADD or ADHD for an example.
Mm-hmm. There are some great studies out there, especially for ADHD. Jill Steiner wrote a great study, I'm old, maybe 10 years ago, that was published in the Journal of Pediatrics about using neurofeedback to treat ADHD. But I would say they are few and far between. And so the question is why is that, right? What's the hang up with the research? I think one of the big reasons why we're not seeing it is because research design with neurofeedback in particular can be a bit tricky, especially if we want to stick to the placebo, double-blinded controlled study, which works great for medication, but not really much else, right? That placebo-controlled double-blinded study is a fantastic method for determining whether or not medication is more effective than a placebo. I don't know that it's a great method for determining if exercise is more effective, right? So think about like the double-blinded study. So you're going to take 10 people and you're going to say, every morning when you wake up, I want you to run 3 miles. And then you're going to take the other 10 people and say, every morning when you wake up, I want you to sit on your couch and watch TV. One of you is in an exercise group, but I'm not going to tell you which group you're in, right? Like that's ludicrous, right? To think that model, that double-blind model, works for exercise. Well, I would say that neurofeedback in a lot of ways is closer to exercise than it is medication in terms of how we experience it, how we do it. In some neurofeedback models, we are asking people to take volitional control of EEG activity. And so how are you going to tell someone, I don't know which group you're in, but also I need you to exert control over this variable? So that model, I think, is great for medication, but it's a poor one for neurofeedback. It does work a little better with neuromodulation. So, TDCS, TACS, where you can tell people, you're not going to feel this or you are going to feel this, but some of the sensors will be on and some of them will not be. It's easier to design a placebo for that than it is for neurofeedback. But I do think that that's a big sort of mark against neurofeedback research. The other thing that I'll say is that neurofeedback sometimes lives in a little bit of an in-between world where it's not quite medical, right? Medical doctors aren't learning about this as part of their training. It's not quite in the world of counselors or psychologists. It's not part of their standard training. So neurofeedback is a thing that people kind of have to come to on their own. And because of that, the people who are reviewing neurofeedback research, in some cases, are not trained in neurofeedback at all. So I've read more than one study where they said, hey, neurofeedback is not an efficacious treatment for A, B, or C. And then you look at the list of authors, and none of them have ever done neurofeedback. None of them have ever done neurofeedback research. And it makes me wonder, how qualified are they to judge this study? Because I'll tell you right now, if you ask me to read or design a study of, say, blood samples, I couldn't do that. I don't know enough to say, this method of collecting and analyzing blood samples is accurate enough. I don't know how to do that. And so I wouldn't feel comfortable saying yes to that. But there are people who don't do neurofeedback, who have never done neurofeedback, who do feel comfortable reading neurofeedback research and commenting on its efficacy. And that seems a little strange to me. If you want to put on the tinfoil hat, you could also look at who those particular authors take speaking payments from. And the answer is almost always the pharmacology industry, right? So that gets into the whole pushback from different sectors about treatment methods and treatment methodology.
Yes, let's put on the tinfoil hat. Is there a historical basis for the kind of antagonism between psychiatry and neurofeedback?
I would guess yes. I don't know specific examples to give you, but I can tell you, like I read a paper, for example. Okay, I read a paper that was published by a doctor in France, and she was studying the efficacy of neurofeedback versus stimulant medication. And she wrote in her paper her conclusion that neurofeedback is not as efficacious as stimulant medication in treating ADHD. Okay, so that's her claim. Neurofeedback doesn't work as well. And then we go into the specifics of the paper. And she specifically notes that each person was titrated to the right amount of stimulant medication based on their height and weight. So they're getting optimal dosing of the medication. For the neurofeedback, she did at-home training with a system that could do up to 4 channels. She did not do brain maps beforehand, and she did 10 15-minute at-home sessions. So I tell clients, research tells us on average you need 20 to 40 sessions. So she did half that. And then she found that those people had about a 20% improvement in ADHD symptoms, and the medication people had about a 40% improvement. So I don't know if she's doing that deliberately. Maybe she doesn't know enough about neurofeedback. Maybe, I don't know the author. I don't know why she designed the study in that way. But as a person who does neurofeedback, I can look at that and say, you are doing suboptimal neurofeedback and comparing it to optimal dosing of stimulant medication. And that feels unfair. And then both groups improve. One group improves about half as much, but you did half as much of it as you're supposed to. So if you had just done the full 20, maybe 30 sessions, does that group also show 40% improvement? So I don't know if that's deliberate, right? This is why I said tinfoil hat. I know that she gets paid by a pharmacological industry, right? She gets paid by a drug company in France to do speaking engagements. Maybe she does not have a conflict of interest. Maybe she doesn't know enough about neurofeedback to design this study correctly or to design the study more accurately. Those questions I don't know. I don't know this woman. But I can look at it from the outside and say, this study feels biased to me. I don't know if it's biased because I haven't done that part of the investigation. I think if you go through the history of neurofeedback, you will find a lot of similar stories of people who are either acting maliciously or acting ignorantly or both. And of course, that also comes with the caveat of not all psychiatry and not all psychiatrists, right? I mean, I work for a psychiatrist. We have a great working relationship. I think there's a lot of psychiatrists who use neurofeedback, who acknowledge the benefits that it has, who acknowledge the benefits of EEG. But certainly there has been some pushback from the pharmaceutical industry, at least in some cases.
Yeah, there's certainly a real range, I mean, obviously, of people in the whole world, but also in mental health and in psychiatry and in neurofeedback. I mean, when you go to a conference, just such a range in terms of experience and also like beliefs and convictions and approaches and background. Have you experienced pushback from psychiatrists or neurologists? Obviously, maybe not like people who you're working from directly, but what's your own personal experience with people maybe like discounting the kind of EEG approach?
Yeah, so I've had it go both ways. You know, I have talked to psychiatrists where I have said, "Hey, look, this is this person's EEG. They have, just in very simple terms, a very slow brain. So maybe we don't want to give them medication that slows things down. Let's give them medication that speeds things up." And I've had psychiatrists and nurse practitioners who have said, "That's very helpful to know. I appreciate that. Thank you for," I don't envy that job because they have to treat an organ they don't usually get to look at. You know, every other doctor, if you go to a doctor for a broken arm, they're going to x-ray your arm before they put you in a cast. Psychiatry doesn't get that benefit most of the time. So I've talked to some who have been very open to that, and that's great. I love that. I've talked to some who aren't. I talked to one person who said I wasn't a medical doctor, so I had no business discussing medication with them. Not even with the client, with the client's doctor, which I find wild. Like, would you say that to a therapist? If a therapist said, "Hey, you know, my client came in, they're drooling on themselves, they can't stay awake, maybe they're over medicated," would the doctor respond, "You're not a doctor, you can't talk to me about medication"? I don't know, but that was a response I got. I talked to one psychiatrist who said that she believed in EEG, she believed in neuroimaging, she believed in using EEG to select medication, but she did not think that neurofeedback was physically possible, which I find just a absurd statement, that someone could look at all of the research dating back to the 50s about the ability of people to change brain function and then reach the conclusion people cannot actually change brain function. You know, I mean, this is decades of research, and she just kind of, willfully closed her eyes to it. So I think the response goes both ways. Maybe the most frustrating response I've had is in talking to neurology, talking to a neurologist. We saw someone come in with ADHD symptoms, and when we looked at their brain, they were having spike and wave discharges, which can be indicative of epilepsy or epilleptiform activity. They were having these discharges once every probably 2 to 3 seconds. So a very unstable EEG, which I'm sure went a long way in driving this kid's inability to pay attention. The discharges were coming from the left prefrontal cortex. So we see these big high amplitude spike and slow wave discharges. We sent him to neurology for a consult. And the neurologist and I traded a few emails. And he said, I agree that this looks epilleptiform. And I said, okay, so did you start him on some type of, medication or epilleptiform treatment? And he said, well, the client never had a seizure. I said, well, that's good. I'm glad he's never had a seizure. Don't we want to be preventative here? And he replied, we don't treat EEGs, we treat patients. I'm not going to put a patient who's never had a seizure on anti-seizure medication. What would I be treating? And I said, well, you're not treating his EEG, you're treating his brain. His brain very clearly looks electrically unstable. And his response was, no, I won't do that. I think that was the most frustrating to me, to see a pattern that so clearly looked like seizures, that a neurologist decided was epilleptiform, but had not sort of gone over the seizure threshold and therefore refused to treat the patient. That was the most frustrating one.
And is there a research basis for this connection between, isolated spike wave epilleptiform activity in the brain and like the symptoms that person was experiencing?
Yes, maybe the research is not as direct as we would like. So we know that that type of brain activity, sometimes we call it IEDs, isolated epileptiform discharge. Sometimes we just call it spike activity. We know that those are more common in people diagnosed with ADHD. We know that they're more common in people diagnosed with psychotic disorders. We know that they respond really well. There is a lot of research that symptoms of those things get better when treated with anti-seizure medication. So we might not have research, at least that I'm aware of, that directly links frontal discharges to ADHD symptoms. We do have research that says if you treat these frontal discharges with anti-epileptic or anti-seizure medication, the behavior improves. So for me, that's all we need. That's enough research for me to say I feel confident in this. I feel confident in understanding the link between the brain activity and the behavior.
And so what are these experiences working with neurologists or psychiatrists who are resistant to what you have to share? How has that shaped your approach now?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that it has changed my approach. I still send EEG reports to anybody, right? Not to anybody who sees the client. So if the client or the patient is seeing a psychiatrist or a counselor or a neurologist, I still send them the EEG report. I still ask them to have a conversation about it. Those requests don't always get answered. I don't know that it's changed my approach. I have been more proactive in outreach to other clinics, though. So, and maybe not psychiatric clinics, but more proactive in outreach to pediatric clinics and general practitioners, because those are the people who are going to say, hey, this client is med resistant, we're going to refer them to psychiatry. And so my outreach has been to them to say, if you do refer to psychiatry, you should refer to us, because we're going to look at their brain before we do anything else. Or maybe not before, but at some point we're going to look at their brain. And there are other practitioners in town who aren't going to do that and who may not even be aware that that's an option or that research exists. I haven't made the focus as much on those practitioners. The person who told me I don't believe that neurofeedback is possible, I just kind of said okay and left it there. You can lead a horse to water, right? I'm not going to beat my head against the door to convince this other psychiatrist that this thing that's been around for 70 years actually works. So then my response was to kind of, okay, well, who's going to refer to a psychiatrist? That's the person I'll talk to, and try to do a little bit more front end education on, hey, this is what we're doing, and this is why it's a little bit different, and this is why it's likely to be a little bit more effective.
And so, what would you say to someone who is considering starting a medication because they're struggling with some, uh, mental health difficulty, or maybe they've self-diagnosed, or they're thinking about just what their options are as to whether they want to go to therapy or something. I think it's interesting how much self-diagnosis is going on. Social media, it's wild to me.
It feels like the Wild West. It really does.
Yeah. So, how would you recommend they approach that question of, I'm curious about medication, but not sure?
So the first thing I would say is don't self-diagnose, right? Mental health is a very complex subject. Leave it to the professionals. The next thing I would say is that I think there is in modern society, we have a little bit of a trend towards conflating emotions with diagnoses. And so what I mean by that is it's okay to feel anxious. Everybody feels anxious. That's an emotion that all humans experience at some point. And I've worked with numerous teenagers, adolescents, young adults who will say, I'm anxious, therefore I have an anxiety disorder. And those two things are not the same thing, right? Everybody gets anxious. That doesn't mean you have an anxiety disorder. So that's a big maybe step before even going to think about seeing a mental health professional. Try to draw out, is this pervasive? Do I feel this way all the time? Or is this an intense feeling I get sometimes? Because those two things are different. But yeah, don't self-diagnose. Leave that to the professional. And then if you're thinking about starting medication, and I don't want to get on here and talk badly about medication. It's super helpful for lots of people. But I would encourage people to think of medication as one potential tool in the mental health journey that they go on, right? One potential pathway. And sometimes people need a little bit of medication. Sometimes people need a little bit of therapy. Sometimes they need neurofeedback or neuromodulation. Sometimes they need all of those things. Sometimes they need one for a little bit and then they can stop and then they go back to another for a little bit, right? So everybody's journey is going to be a little bit different. I would also recommend, if possible, before starting medication, to do some type of neuroimaging, functional neuroimaging. That's not always possible for everybody. A lot of times you have to pay out of pocket for those places. The insurance system in this country is a disaster. It's a nightmare. So I understand why that's not always an option. Sometimes people live in places where it's hard to even find a doctor, let alone a mental health doctor, let alone a mental health doctor who buys into the idea of functional neuroimaging. So that's a step that not everyone can take. But if you live in a place where that's available, I would highly recommend go get an EEG, go get a QEEG before you start the medication journey, because it might help to reduce some of the guess and check that we have to do sometimes with medication. It can help guide the process at least a little bit.
And then a question more geared towards like the, neurofeedback audience. There's a lot of neurofeedback practitioners out there, and their main goal when they're looking at an EEG is to kind of come up with a protocol to do training with someone. Hopefully they're doing that. They're not just slapping electrodes on and clicking the Z-score button. But what has your experience been in terms of presentations that really aren't going to respond well to neurofeedback, where it's more appropriate to get a psychiatrist on board?
Yeah. So I mentioned him earlier, but Ron Swatsina is a very prominent voice in this field. I think he just published a paper on the factors that limit the efficacy of neurofeedback. So one of them is sleep, right? Neurofeedback is a learning process. We are trying to teach the brain something new. And to learn, you have to remember. And the biggest thing that will limit your memory or your ability to learn new things is sleep. That's the biggest obstacle to learning. So if people are not sleeping well for whatever reason, neurofeedback may be less effective than we want it to be. And if you are seeing someone for sleep issues that are coming from the brain, then you just kind of have to work your way through that process. But there can be lots of other issues that negatively impact people's sleep. EMF radiation, food and nutrition, caffeine intake. I worked with a client who complained that she felt jittery, anxious, and really struggled going to sleep, and told me she drank 8 espressos a day. So, okay, well, let's start there then. Let's get that
I
down
wonder
to
why.
yeah, let's get that down to 4 and see what happens. So there's lots of factors that affect sleep, but that's a big one. Another one is if there is a systemic illness in the body that is going untreated, that affects the brain, right? So think about things like environmental exposures to toxic chemicals. I'm sure you've come across cases where somebody works as like an industrial cleaner and every day they open a tub of a solvent and they're not wearing a mask at work. Stuff like that where they're constantly exposing their body and their brain to chemicals that are bad for both. Then neurofeedback is going to be pretty tricky, I think.
Drinking contaminated water.
Yeah, drinking contaminated water, living in a house with severe mold issues. There's lots of different sort of toxic exposures that people get to, but yeah, that would be another one. I think, if you asked Ron, he would say a lot of medication refractory cases come from isolated epilleptiform discharges, but that's something that we know neurofeedback is actually pretty good at treating, right? You have to do the EEG first. You have to see it in the EEG first. But if you target those discharges with SMR and a low band reduction or a low band inhibit, you can make pretty good progress there. So I think the two big ones are sleep and then also that sort of toxic continuous exposure. The other one I would add, and this is a little bit less on the efficacy of neurofeedback and more on the measurable change in behavior. So I've seen a number of clients over the years. I'm sure anybody who works in this field is instantly familiar with what I'm talking about, where the client comes and they do their neurofeedback, and that seems to go okay. Their brain responds during sessions, they make changes over time. You feel confident that your neurofeedback practice is working. And then at the same time, the behavior is not changing, right? They're still having blowups at home. They're still not engaging in class or whatever the case may be. In those cases, I kind of refer people to the biopsychosocial model, right? You've got biology, you've got psychology, and you've got the social or environmental factors. And neurofeedback is changing biology. And it's very good at changing biology. It's very successful more often than not at changing biology. So we like that. But maybe then it becomes an issue with skills or cognition. That's the psychology part. And maybe it's environmental factors. And, then we need like family systems work or family therapy work. And I've worked with a number of families where the child has made good progress in terms of changing brain function, but the family itself is dysfunctional in the way that they interact and communicate with each other. And that inhibits change or progress in behavioral outcomes. It doesn't necessarily inhibit progress with neurofeedback itself.
So, as we come to a close here, I'm curious, what conversations do you want to be having in the future? Who do you want to be talking to? And what questions do you want investigated deeper?
What a fun question. So I have moved pretty steadily from neurofeedback more and more into stimulation. So neuromodulation, transcranial alternating current, transcranial direct current. And I think that field has a lot of immense potential, but also some unanswered questions about things like montage placements, about things like the application of noise, whether it's slow noise or fast noise. So those are questions I have, and who to talk to for those. Certainly Nick and Tiff at Neurofield. They're sort of on the cutting edge of that thing, but there are other people in that field that I think are asking really good questions about, this is a powerful tool. We know that it's a powerful tool. Now, what's the best way to use it? So that's one area. I'm also very curious about electromagnetic field exposures and how those are going to impact people moving forward. There's a lot of evidence that they are not healthy for us. And we live in an environment that is sort of saturated with them. Dr. Turner talks about this quite a bit. If anybody's seen him talk, the last time I talked to him, we talked about how when the body experiences a toxic exposure, right? You drink poison. Your body has organs that are designed to help you in that situation, right? You have a liver, you have kidneys, you have a system in place to filter your blood, to pull toxins or poisons out of your blood. Your body is not designed to help protect you or prevent exposure from EMF. And so, and so now we live in this environment that is absolutely saturated with EMF. You're getting it from the electricity in your walls. You're getting it from your router, your cell phone, the wireless around us all day. If you're using wireless headphones, the whole environment around us is saturating us with EMF. So how we choose, if we choose to combat that moving forward as a society, I think will be a really important question. And then the last one, and this one is one that I've seen pop up quite a bit recently, is the effect of social media on people, especially on adolescents. And not even necessarily social media, but just the reliance on technology in general. I talked to Mary Swingle, and she made this great point about when technology is used early in development as a soothing tool or a soothing mechanism. So, you go out to lunch with the little kids and they're getting kind of restless, and you give them a phone to play with. That lays very early pathways towards technological addiction, to using technology as a method of self-soothing, right? Where we end up raising kids who are unable to self-quiet or self-calm, and they need technology in order to do so. That to me fits the very definition of addiction, right? We use the same terminology when we talk about substance abuse disorders. And so I think that's going to be something really important moving forward. And something that we're going to have to be really comfortable having really hard conversations about. When is it okay to give kids technology? What kind of technology are they using? How are they using it? All those are questions that I think as a society we might not be like super prepared for, but kind of have to be. And, as an EEG person, I'm always curious about how that stuff looks in an EEG, right? If we see somebody who is absolutely dealing with tech addiction issues, what does their EEG look like? Does it look different from other people's? And how do we go about treating it?
And if you could talk to one person about one of those topics on this show, perhaps in the future, who would it be?
Rusty Turner. I'm biased. I worked for him. He's one of the nicest people I've ever met. He's a fantastic guy, super knowledgeable. And I think his place as a neurologist makes him, and a neurologist who's worked in the field for so long, makes him uniquely qualified to talk about the differences in brains that he has seen over time as technology has become more and more prevalent. And also in terms of treating that, both with neurofeedback and with just lifestyle changes. I think he's a fantastic resource. And again, he's got such a great sense of how things have changed over time because he's been in the field of neurology for however many years. He's there pre smart tech and he's there post smart tech, so he can kind of see it from both sides. I would absolutely love if my job became obsolete. I'll retire to Spain tomorrow. I'm good with it. I love being able to help people. I really do. But man, sometimes it definitely feels like we are rowing a boat against the current, and I would absolutely love for people to get to a place where they didn't need to see me. Or if I could just shift my work from a clinical perspective to a performance perspective. And everybody I saw, it was just peak performance training instead of dealing with clinical anxiety disorders or depressive disorders.
All right, Cory. It's good to chat. Thanks for coming on EEGworld. And where can people find you?
I don't do social media at all. So the answer to that question is I live in Nashville. Come to Nashville. Or my email address is on our website, nashvillechild-and-family-wellness.com. So it's very easy to find me there. You can always email me. I'm happy to chat if anybody has questions.